Welcome to Conversations from the Edge of Consciousness. I'm your host, Kristine Madera. For me, and possibly for you, the inner world of consciousness has always been much more real and way more fun than the so-called real material world. Growing up, I thought I was alone in this, but I'm not. There are a lot of us, and far too many have no one to talk to who shares this experience. I've been lucky to cultivate a community of friends who love to talk about the energies, ideas, and vibrations that are pushing the edges of our own consciousness, as well as our collective consciousness. In Conversations from the Edge, we share our conversations with you. Welcome to Conversations from the Edge. This is your host, Kristine Madera, and we are back today with Jana Roemer. And Jana is an astrologer and a yogi who has synthesized 20 years of study and teaching astrology and yoga nidra to create astro nidras, which is a lying down meditation where the body really relaxes and the awareness remains online. And you're able to do some very deep body and mind work and incorporate astrology into that. So what we talk about with Jana is how astrology works in the body, but also how astrology can be kind of like a life coach as we move through the various seasons of the zodiac. And so today we're going to be talking about Gemini, which is the third sign in the astrological year. Welcome, Jana. It's very exciting to have you back.
Well, thank you so much for having me back. It's so fun to come and chat with you. So Gemini as the archetype, we started talking about Aries as the baby and Taurus as the toddler orienting themselves through the world through their senses. And Gemini is when the little kid gets their voice and they start to ask the question, why? Why? Mom, why? And that question, why, and that stage in life is endless. And so one of the key trademarks of the Gemini archetype is curiosity and communication. And I was recently speaking with one of my colleagues, her name is Nadia, who does mythological astrology. And she was sharing with me that in the mythology, the Hermes was the god that that inspires or works with Mercury, and that's the planet that rules Gemini. And Mercury as a planet from a mythological standpoint is able to traverse the underworld as well as the exalted world. So it can travel between the light and the dark, or the higher and lower mind. And when we look at Gemini, the way that it's represented in visual is the twins. And the twins represent, well, it can be said a few different ways, but to me, the twins represent the angel and the devil on the shoulder, and not really knowing the difference between the two yet because they're so young. They're like, why? And so they're exploring. And so there's this really beautiful naivety of like what is shadow and what is dark, and what is wrong and what is right. And oftentimes when you meet a Gemini, they do tend to have a little bit of mischievous wit about them. They're very quick-minded because they don't have a lot of layers on top of them of like, you should do this or you shouldn't do that. Because they're more interested and committed to the curiosity of understanding their environment than they are jaded to other people's opinions. Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally makes sense. And, as you were talking about that with the upper and the lower minds, what it called to mind for me is that, the brain as it is kind of amoral. Like it doesn't know right and wrong and good and bad and stuff. It's things that we learn. And so it sounds like the perfect place to really be curious about what it is that we have learned and how we've begun to operate in right and wrong and good and bad in ways that are kind of made up as opposed to necessarily universally true.
I love that, because where I was going to go next with it is that in this stage of life, when kids are asking why and they're orienting themselves to a greater understanding of the world, they start to actually develop those programs and those conditions and those belief systems that we then carry with us for the rest of our lives. So an example, a really simple example would be if let's say a 3 or 4-year-old were to see their mom see a spider, and it was the first time they saw a spider ever, and the mom was like, ah, and ran and grabbed a newspaper and killed the spider, the kid
Uh-huh.
would adopt that similar reaction to a spider that would
Mm-hmm.
stay with them unless or a different scenario was witnessed. And so
Mm-hmm.
let's say instead of seeing the mom first, they saw their older sibling first, and the older sibling saw the spider and instead put their finger to the spider and let the spider crawl up its arm. And it was like, ooh, look at the spider. Then that would
Mm-hmm.
be a different program. And neither of those programs are inherently wrong, but they're what's witnessed. And then that's how we learn how to orient ourselves to the world, is by the
Yes.
information that we are exposed to. And so Gemini generally rules community, but it also starts to rule our social understanding or our social programming.
Hmm.
And so, and it has a big influence on like the neuro architecture and the way that we are creating the strongest neural pathways in our brain based off of that type of exposure. And we see that through our whole lives, right? And if we look at the
Mhm.
mirror, or the twins, pardon me, as a mirror, but they're sitting on either sides of the fence. We could look at this partially in our own communities, the way that we are divided,
Mhm.
and I'm not going to get into what side of the divide, but we are a community that is divided, or we are like North America is very much divided, and we are looking at each other, but more so than listening, what we're doing is projecting on the other. And what Gemini season, one of the things that Gemini season is asking us to do is to recognize that it's a mirror and asking you to move beyond the mirror into a deeper state of listening,
Oh, we all need that.
right?
Yes.
It's so important right now for the health of humanity.
And for our personal health, because it takes a lot of energy to continue to project outward and
Mhm.
to hold your stance, in a very rigid way, which is kind of everybody's kind of moving into that rigidity. And as much as it feels a little threatening and sometimes it's a little exhausting to try to find conversation partners that disagree with you, letting go of your own rigidity and just opening up to other viewpoints as viewpoints. That's it. It's just what people believe. It helps to soften the body, and I've been working on that a lot, especially in Taurus season. That's what we
Yeah.
talked about softening the body and softening into life and softening into the world, and really not coming to it from that place of rigidity and that place of like I'm right, or that place of like maybe I'm not entirely right, but it feels right, so I'm going to go with it. So
Yes.
I like the idea of using this as a mirror.
Yeah. And then instead of seeking to speak and be
Mm-hmm.
right, it's asking us to listen and understand.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in our bodies, Gemini lives in a few different places. It lives in our thyroid gland and our vocal cords, our voice
Mm-hmm.
box, and it lives in our lungs and in our arms all the way out to our hands. And
Mm-hmm.
um, where Taurus rules the sense of touch, Gemini starts to rule. Now that touch moves into the nervous system, and so Gemini lives in the peripheral nervous system, so our hands and our feet, and the way that information then travels from that exploration of the world into our system, which then signals our chemical system. And that's prepping us for Cancer season, because that's where the emotions are really quite big. In Gemini season, it's very much the intellect. It's a mutable air sign, which is
Mm-hmm.
so good for what we were just talking about with seeking to understand and listening perhaps to an opposing viewpoint or belief, is that um, during Gemini season, our minds are malleable. Mutable means to be able to change, and the
Mm-hmm.
air is our intellect. And so, as we seek new information, as we seek a greater understanding, our perception of reality perhaps may change. And my challenge for people during Gemini season is to not turn your back on the topics of the divide, but to
Mm-hmm.
look also beyond the topics of the divide. I almost hesitate to even say some of the topics, but we can look to the topics of community mental health. That would be very much Gemini. Like
Mm-hmm.
community mental health, like what is the impact of what we are doing? We
Mm-hmm.
could look at topics like the super hot topic, that's the divide, is vaccines, but could we look
Mm-hmm.
beyond vaccines into the biotech world? And what are they doing with gene therapy? And I'm not referring to vaccines at all. I'm actually referring to more of beyond, like cancer and
Mm-hmm.
hearing. And they're doing a lot of really interesting things in the biotech world. And
Yeah.
everybody's so distracted on the one topic. And I'm like, wait, you guys, we all know where you stand. You're yelling at each other and you're not going to change anybody's mind. It's cool. You can be there. That's cool.
Yeah.
But like, look at this stuff. Hey, look over here. And that's what Gemini's curiosity is pointing us towards. It's like, hey, check this out. Hey, check this out. Whoa, what about this? Did you see this latest research on what they're finding about cancer? What about this like really interesting research about dementia and Alzheimer's and in women and Parkinson's in men? And,
Mm-hmm.
these are issues of the nervous system, which are all very much Gemini in nature.
Oh, well, and also what I wanted to add in here, this when you were talking about Gemini and curiosity and this divide that we have, one of the exercises that I started doing, even as a young kid, because I was trying to understand the world more, which I suppose maybe this is a Gemini, is that when there was somebody with a different viewpoint, not necessarily an opposing viewpoint, because I wasn't, we weren't quite as oppositional back in the day, but with a different viewpoint or a different religion or a different language, or that I knew that they had a different somehow that I could identify. And maybe they thought different about something. I would say, okay, so if I were this person and I were raised to believe, A, B, C, D, that I knew about that person, or whether it was their religion or their political beliefs or whatever it happened to be, what would I think or believe about this particular thing that I had a really strong opinion about? And it actually taught me how opinions form, and that my own opinions were formed from my experience and other people's opinions are formed from their beliefs and their experience. And that when I began to see that I could see things from their viewpoint, it really helped to kind of dismantle my attachment to my own opinion. And it didn't necessarily make me think that they were right and I was wrong, but it did kind of open the floor to there being a lot more possibility of what is true versus what I believe to be true out there in the world. That I kind of backed away from my opinion as truth and really kind of looked at, well, what's actually factual. And that was really helpful in dismantling my own like triggering nervous system.
Yeah. And how instead of the answer, no, listen, the answer is interesting. Taking a minute to let the information land.
Yeah. And asking
Yeah.
questions.
More questions. That's
Yeah.
what Gemini season wants.
Oh, perfect.
Gemini season is like ask all the questions all day long, forever and ever. Amen. Just keep going with the questions, because the reality is we're living in this time where we actually don't have answers, and
Mm-hmm.
we have more questions than answers when we really look at reality, but we have
Mm-hmm.
more people giving answers than we are allowed to ask questions. I'm
Yes.
I'm really contemplating this, and like answers close the mind because answers like boom, end of
Mm-hmm.
story. Questions open the mind. And that's like the beginning of the scientific method is what's the question? And then once they ask the question, they look at the circumstances and they observe what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
That's the basis of the scientific method. That's Gemini's like ask the question. Ask the
Well,
question.
that's
That's right.
perfect. Yeah, because everything now is coming from conclusion. This is what I want to believe is true. So, what is the evidence that support this belief? Rather than, okay, so whatever the topic is, what's the question, and how do we actually, answer the question or rise to a higher level of consciousness to come to solutions that are not based in division.
Yeah. And can we
Yeah.
stay with the question a little bit longer,
Yeah.
even if it makes you challenge your beliefs, even if, and actually, if we're getting into it, on the 26th of May, 1 week into Gemini season, we actually have the full moon in Sagittarius, and
Mm-hmm.
it is an eclipse because we have the north and south node is on the Gemini Sagittarius axis. And this one is a real doozy because so the North Node and the South Node are not actually planets. They are magnetic nodes or
Mm-hmm.
points that go with the moon, like they're magnetic points for the moon. And in
Oh.
astrology, we think of the North Node as like your North Star. It's like where you're headed. It helps you
Mm-hmm.
understand your fate, your destiny. And then the South Node, although popular culture, pop culture, pop astrology culture specifically, will say it's what you're leaving behind. It's actually what needs to be integrated. So lots of times the south node is it needs integration so it
Mm-hmm.
can rest, right? If you think of
Right.
like a trauma response in the body, a trauma response in a body is uh, information that has yet to be integrated, or an experience that has yet to be integrated. It's still like a live wire in the body, and it creates all
Mm-hmm.
kinds of discord in the body. And so when we're looking at the south node, which is this Sagittarius full moon is on the south node in Sagittarius. And Sagittarius has a lot to do with our higher learning and our belief systems
Mm-hmm.
and our relationship with God.
Oh,
And
interesting.
yeah, and I use that language specifically because it's not necessarily our relationship with religion. It's actually your direct relationship with whatever you define source to be. And so this eclipse on that, like bringing the first week of Gemini season
Mm-hmm.
home, is saying, how's your faith? What is your
Mm-hmm.
relationship with faith? Like, where does your faith lie? What is your relationship with source, God, the universe, spirit, creator, whatever title makes you comfortable, right? Like, what
Mm-hmm.
is that relationship? And it's time to look at that relationship and deepen that relationship so that it is integrated in your life. And also, in doing so, are there belief systems that have shown up as coping mechanisms because of the lack of integration of your relationship with source?
That's a big load of work, especially, when you get to people who are really adhering to a traditional dogma or religion. The faith becomes in the stories, the stories that explain that the divine explain God, rather than the intimate connection with that God. And I know for me, coming up in a religious background, like there was a lot of dismantling between what is it that I what were the stories I believed in versus what is the divine that I believe in, and in trying to disentangle those. And it was a little process, but wow, when I was able to untangle the stories from the relationship, the relationship got much deeper. And that's a big load of work right there if that's the south node and we're integrating
It's a huge amount
our,
of work.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, I got a little bit excited because that just came in naturally. But one thing to note is that we've been all planets direct
Mm-hmm.
for Aries season and the majority of Taurus season, with the exception of Pluto. But Pluto is retrograde 5 months out of every year, and we don't give Pluto as much attention.
Right,
Like,
yeah.
it's not messing with you on a day-to-day basis. It's
Mm-hmm.
helping you develop a deeper relationship with your intuition, but it's not messing with you. In Gemini season, first we have Saturn stationing retrograde. Then we
Ooh.
have, yeah, and Saturn retrograde is, well, in this case, it's in Aquarius. And so it's asking us to look at our role in our greater community and the way that we participate in innovating that community,
Mm-hmm.
and our relationship with the restrictions or the contractions or the boundaries that we are collectively experiencing. And
Hmm.
the timing of this retrograde is interesting because we are at such a endurance point, like I feel like the call for endurance right now is so huge. It's so
Yes.
huge. We're close. It feels like we're almost out of this pandemic, but we're not.
No.
And there are things that are happening that are making us feel like we're more out of it. And the regulations are changing, and the people are feeling safer because they've taken the vaccination or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
And so there are definitely changes happening. We're coming into a new phase of it, but it's not over. And Saturn's
No.
saying, stay with me. Stay with me.
Mm-hmm.
We've got boundaries still. And when Saturn is in an abusive or a not so friendly situation, this could be greater lockdowns. Who knows though? Because it also could be a deeper sense of organization. It could also be this realigning of system and structure that actually helps us grow. And everybody will experience it differently
Mm-hmm.
depending on your relationship with boundaries and your
Right.
relationship with authority. So that one's really interesting. And then not too long after that, we have Mercury stationing retrograde, and Mercury is stationing retrograde in Gemini, and Mercury is at home in Gemini. So this will be one of the strongest Mercury retrogrades that we will have until we see it happen in Virgo again, which won't be for quite some time. I personally think that the astrology of this retrograde has the potential to be very helpful. I'm not of the house that Mercury retrogrades are out to get you. I
Mm-hmm.
do think that they pose challenges.
Mm-hmm.
If we're not listening, if we're not heeding or yielding to the teachings of a Mercury retrograde. But the way that I see a Mercury retrograde is that this is a call to humanity to slow down. And it's the completion of a cycle. So it's a 3 or 4 month-ish cycle that we're coming to a
Mm-hmm.
completion in. And Mercury is the messenger of information. And what's unique about this one, aside from the fact that Mercury is in its own sign while it's happening, is that Mercury only has 2 planetary aspects the
Mm-hmm.
entire retrograde. 2. Normally, Mercury will aspect many more planets. This time, 2. In 3.5 weeks, it only has an aspect with 2 other planets, which means Mercury is essentially free to do what Mercury needs to do. So Mercury will
Oh.
take you to the underworld if you need to embrace your shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Mercury will bring you blessings of information. Mercury will spark curiosity that helps you to open and change your mind. And anytime we see a Mercury retrograde, the major benefit of a Mercury retrograde is the opportunity for a shift in perspective that leads to liberation. Now, having said all of that, it's also happening during eclipse season. So eclipse
Mm-hmm.
season is always more challenging because there's the Sagittarius full moon, but then there's also the Gemini new moon. New moon, you wouldn't be able to even see it with your bare eye, but
Mm-hmm.
eclipses generally have us reeling a little bit. So there's that. What's nice is that I think Mercury retrograde has the potential to help us.
Mm-hmm.
It helps us by listening and paying attention to what Mercury has to say and
Mm-hmm.
giving ourselves a break from the grind
Mm-hmm.
and letting ourselves be unaspected. Like, I actually only committed to one thing for the entire month of May, and I have yet to commit to really anything for the month of June yet because I want to feel this unaspected. Like, I want to be able to say yes in the moment rather than, oh, I can't, I already committed to something. And what Mercury retrograde is asking us to do is leave the schedule open. Leave your schedule
Okay.
more open. Undercommit yourself.
Well, that sounds good. Because it has been so intense for the last, gosh, year and a half now. Well, actually, it's been really intense for years, but year and a half in particular with the pandemic and things. And then if we're coming into this eclipse in this south node that's really asking us to take a look at what our relationship is with our God, which is really what is our relationship with our divine self, like with
Yes.
who we are on that level. And there's a lot of energy that's moving us in that direction of really exploring and understanding and integrating and downloading and awakening to that. But really, you can't do that if you are overly scheduled, if you don't have that time to really ponder or to walk
Yeah.
in the woods or on the beach or whatever your happy place is, because it's like this pivotal change in how we orient ourselves in the
Yes.
world at this time, which is part of the larger story going on, is that we're all reorienting to a more multidimensional experience of ourselves, and that connection with our divine is pivotal to that. And I think if you don't if you're not mindful and do this with some openness and some expansion and some intention, it's not gonna be an easy transit.
And think about it from this perspective too. If we're meant to change our minds,
Mm-hmm.
then if you change your mind and you don't want to do what you said you were going to do before because it's no longer aligned with you and you're already committed, then you got to break a promise or you got to break a commitment or just go make it easier for yourself in advance.
Totally. And there was something, we were talking about questions there, and this is one that might really help people through this. And you have a lot of time to ponder it, apparently, coming up if we all underschedule ourselves. Is, when we get these belief systems that come up and say, and this is what I do, what if that wasn't true?
Yes.
Or if I hear something that's different and I'm like, what if that was true? And it challenges my own beliefs, and it really helps me get out of my own way. But it sounds like, especially when it comes to that deep connection with your deep self, and I bring a lot of preconceived notions to that as well, and then I'll catch one and I'm like, well, what if that wasn't true? I've been operating for years, decades, as if this were true, but what if that wasn't true? How would I be
Yeah.
free? And it's
Yeah.
a really good self-freeing exercise to challenge your own truth.
Yeah. And I think really asking where the origin of your belief came
Mm-hmm.
from. Like, where did this come from again?
Yeah. And not trying to replace it with another belief, but what if this wasn't true? How much space can I create with that? What else is possible if this isn't true, that I can just ponder as a possibility?
Yeah. So it's fun. Once you get there, it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
fun to play in that
Yeah.
world. I know that I sometimes trigger people with asking those exact same questions. So if anybody feels triggered right now, just take a couple of breaths and write it down and come back to the idea later, because I know a lot of the topics that we are emotional about at this time have a lot of meaning to us. And it's very difficult to imagine that another possibility could even exist. But I think that
Mm-hmm.
comes from that question, like, is this true? Are you referring to Byron Katie's work?
No, I was doing this before I heard Byron Katie's work. I thought, oh, good, she's got up to 4 questions. Isn't that simple? I would interview myself, because if I didn't have anybody to talk to before, I was a podcast host and I could talk to people. And even before when I was too shy to really have deep conversations with people, I would imagine myself as like me and Oprah sitting down, and I was playing both parts. And so Oprah would ask me questions, and they were really they were Oprah questions. They were good questions, but I would squirm and wiggle and I'd have to either defend my truth or let it go. And so in doing that, I realized how much I believed was true that really was based on nothing but what I had learned, that I could find plenty of evidence that it wasn't true in other places or for other people. And it really helped me to begin to look at beliefs and truths a different way. And it's really freeing for me to let go of something that I thought was true, because then there's this new spaciousness that invites you into something new without having to make something else true. It's like this spaciousness of possibility. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, one of the big ones for me, we're kind of diverging out, but I'll just say this one, we can
I
go
love
back
it.
to Gemini, is, that whole idea of our reality as a giant simulated reality or virtual reality game.
Yes.
I'd heard that, and I heard it multiple times, and I was just like, yeah. And then I sat down and I began to quiz myself, like, what if this really was true? What
Yeah.
if it was true that this was a giant reality game? We're all players in this game. And part of the game is that we forget that we're players in the game, but we're all showing up to play this game. What if this was true? We're all 99.999% space. That's true.
Mhm.
And so what if this is all just a projection? And I sat with it. First, I ran away from that. And then I sat with it. And then as I sat with it, like all of the constructions around how I thought life was morally constructed, how I thought it was constructed in the good, bad, right, wrong, true, false stuff fell away. Because in a virtual reality game, we just make up the rules and then we play by the rules. And then when the game ends, you start a new game with different rules. And I was like, oh my God. And it really set myself free on so many levels. Whether or not it's true, I don't know if it's true. I don't really care if it's true, but it was a freedom exercise
Yes.
to be able to say, well, if this was true, then all of this other stuff I'm holding on to is just baggage. And why would I want to hamper myself that way? And it all fell away. I still find remnants, but mostly it fell away.
You're basically outlining the work for people to do on the Sagittarius full moon.
Oh,
Be-
perfect.
yeah, because you don't you can even take the same concept, the same end destination that you're getting through the simulation.
Mm-hmm.
We could travel to another culture and have our beliefs and our constructs
Mm-hmm.
dismantled by going somewhere else. Like
Yes.
I remember when I was in India, this is so silly and so simple. You would think like of all the things in India, this wouldn't be what does it, but um, they don't wear wedding rings
Mm-hmm.
in India. They use piercings and head
Right. Yeah.
coverings instead.
Mm-hmm.
And like so naive and so silly of me, but I was like, really? You don't wear a ring? Like, you don't? I thought everybody did that. And
Uh-huh.
I mean, like it's so silly, but then all of
Mm-hmm.
a sudden that one piece, like
Mm-hmm.
it was like pulling a string on a knit sweater. It was like
Yeah.
pulling a thread on a knit sweater, and I was like, now everything else that I've been seeing visually with my eyes that is different, all of it started opening. It was like the Matrix opened. It's like I saw behind the Wizard of
Mm-hmm.
Oz curtain, like everything was just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And traveling around the world deconstructs our idea of
Yes.
reality. Every time we go to another culture, it's like, okay, this is
Mm-hmm.
Balinese culture now, or okay, this is African. Well, you'd have to break it down to which African country, like
Yeah.
anywhere you go, you're going to have to deconstruct and reconstruct reality again and again and again. And Sagittarius rules foreign cultures, and it also
Oh.
rules truth seeking. So there are multiple layers within that one. And Gemini and Sagittarius are opposite each other across the
Mm-hmm.
zodiac. And so Gemini is asking us to look at our local communities, but we really only understand our local community when we
Mm-hmm.
look outside into a foreign community and we allow the differences and the diversity to deconstruct what we hold rigid in our own, you know?
Oh,
Like,
absolutely. And I'm right with you on foreign travel, like the same thing. It's one of the best ways to get to know yourself is to go somewhere where everything that mirrors back to you is completely different than what you expect it to be.
exactly. Okay, so let's talk more about the astrology story because it gets interesting. So
Okay.
on June 5th,
Uh-huh.
we have Pluto
Mm-hmm.
opposite Mars. Now, this will happen every year and a half ish, except for on years where there's retrogrades, which means we have not had this in a very long time because at the end of 2020, we had an enormous Mars retrograde where it stayed in Aries, the sign of Aries, for 6 whole months. And it usually stays in a sign for 6 weeks to 2 months. So, major delay in the progress forward with Mars through the zodiac. And this one
Mm-hmm.
is up, not delay, just a slowdown. We needed to get some of those Aries fighter, war, protest energy.
Mm-hmm.
But this one is really interesting because it's Mars is opposite Pluto. Pluto is in Capricorn. Pluto is a major player in every way, shape, or form that society has changed itself over the last year and a half. Pluto is in the sign of Capricorn, and it's really deep work that it's doing slowly but consistently and
Mm-hmm.
tirelessly is it's deconstructing governments and systems of authority and power. Like that's what Pluto's really up to. And now it's sitting opposite Mars, which is our passions and our purpose. And like Mars is the god of war, the lord of war. It's like, what are we willing to go to battle for? And then they are square Eris, which is an asteroid. And some astrologers argue that it's not as much Pluto that's causing all the upheaval in the world right now, or all the deconstruction of the reality that once was. It's actually Eris. And now we have Mars and Eris in mythology. They're sisters, and they like sit together on the chariot on their way out to war. I'm gonna just put this disclaimer. I'm talking metaphorically, and I'm talking mythology when I'm using that in this context. But then it's Pluto, and Pluto is death, transformation, and rebirth, but Pluto is ultimately the underworld. Pluto will take us into our shadow in order to restore the light, in order to rebirth us.
Well, yes. And to add to this too, as I believe that the United States is in its Pluto return.
We're very close.
Yeah, or coming into it, which just adds that other level, at least in the US, of conflict and turmoil and deconstruction and reconstruction. And so we've got a double whammy if you're in the US or anybody that's affected by the US.
Which is the world.
Most
really.
Everybody, yes.
Yeah, it's the world. Indirectly or directly. It's too big of a player on the world stage to not affect everybody. So we're gonna see some. I think there's potential to see some action in people's passion, and like Eris has a lot to do with protests, and even though we're not necessarily seeing protesting happening on the mainstream media, it's definitely happening on the streets of all over the world. It's all over the world, and we're going to see more, or at least the astrology indicates that there's a high likelihood that we will see more of this happening in June.
But if you've started your deconstruction during the Sagittarius full moon, then when we get to this piece of it, you'll already be in the habit of deconstruction.
Well, I mean, I think we're all kind of in the habit of deconstruction right now.
I don't know. Have you looked out in the world recently?
No, you're right.
There's a lot of resistance to that.
Right, which is deconstruction in its own right. Maybe just not conscious. Maybe just not conscious deconstruction. And that's what this can be. That's what this can be, is more of that unconscious deconstruction. Like what happens when we aren't listening? What happens when, because right around the corner from that, and we're very much in the energy, and the whole theme of 2021 is this battle between the old and the new, the tradition and the innovation, the safe and steady, reliable, consistent securities of the world versus rapid transformation, spontaneous eruption of new information, like just the quickness that happens with innovation. Like you can't unknow something once you know it. And that's a bigger theme. And there's 3 dates over the course of 2021 where Saturn and Uranus are squaring each other. And it happens, the second one happens on June 14th. And so Uranus is a slow planet, slower than Saturn. Saturn's also a slow planet. We're already in the energy of this. It's just gonna, as we move through June, as we move through Gemini season, it's just gonna keep getting bigger. So my take on this is that, think of that little kid that's going, why? Why are they asking why? They're so present to the world that they couldn't stop themselves from saying why if they tried. And I think that's where we need to be to really understand what's going on, because as the powers that be, this is Pluto and Mars opposition, Mars as the people, Pluto is the power. In Saturn and Uranus square, Saturn is also the people, and Uranus is, but it's the old boys club. Sorry to pick on white men, but it's what the narrative is. It's like the old white men that want to hold the power and keep the authority, versus Uranus, which is like new. Well, Uranus is actually older, but it's new. It's new, it's innovative. It's like it wants change. It seeks change. It seeks renewal. And so this battle between the old and the new and the powers that be and the people all happening at the same time. So we're creating like quite a perfect recipe for some decent amount of resistance, could be a good word,
Yeah.
conflict, and also, I don't know, maybe I would love to hear what you feel about this, but I feel like we're still drudging up the bottom of the sea. We're still drudging up like the base of our own shadow.
Mm-hmm.
We're still like in an archaeological dig of like the old, outdated stuff within ourselves. And every time there's this external event, because now you have to remember Saturn is retrograde and Pluto is retrograde. So we're being asked
Mm-hmm.
to look inside of ourselves. Every time there's an external event that triggers us, those of us that are really doing the work, we look inside to be like, okay, wait, why is this triggering me? What do I have to look in here? And so we continue with that deconstruction.
We've had this conversation before a little bit. My experience of Saturn is a little bit different than what is projected onto Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, when I'm listening to you to say this, that it seems almost like Saturn to me, when you were saying it, represents not so much the what is the old guard in the world, but what is in the old guard within ourselves that we've held on to, like the old programming, old ideas of how the world works, old ideas of power structures, old ideas of things that maybe, the changes that Uranus is asking us to do are challenging those deeply held senses of identity of who we are that are constructed onto those old ideas and beliefs about power, about who we are, about those deep core identities that you were talking about that we learn, in the very beginning when we're just beginning to socialize, just beginning to be in the world. We kind of get these meta structures that are put down, and it's like Saturn is like the meta structures. And if you're holding on to the meta structures, and you're identifying with them as you, and that you're constructing your higher layers of identity on those, it's a pretty painful process of deconstructing that. But that when you are in that place where you're actively challenging your own assumptions, you're doing your own deconstruction, that you're not as tied to those old ideas as you, then it's easier to allow this new energy to come in, because it's coming in to change those inner structures. It's not coming in to like paint the walls. So if you're changing those inner structures, there's a lot of resistance to that. And I think we put it on white men, but it really is like where the power structures lie. And when you're identified with those power structures, or we put those power structures and we say, this is what they look like, or this is how they operate, and this is my relationship to them. And if you're tied to that, it's really painful to begin to let go, no matter how you're tied to it, whether you're tied to it in opposition or you're tied to it like in collaboration, or in, identifying with that as you. That was a little rambling.
And for the sake of Gemini, to honor Gemini is also to see the other side of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because on the Gemini new moon on June 11th, it's also an eclipse. It's a weak eclipse, but it still is an eclipse. Saturn is actually in favorable energy to the new moon. And what
Mm.
Saturn's teaching us here is saying, Saturn's like, great, innovate, but don't let history repeat itself.
Mm-hmm.
You innovate through honoring the tradition. So to use the metaphor, I think you were talking about like the structure of the old home or something, is
Mm-hmm.
the image in my head was like this. Where I live, there's these beautiful old Victorian homes, but there's also these old stone buildings. And the stone buildings and these old Victorian homes have a great influence in the charm of what this little town is.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we just like ripped out these beautiful stone buildings and
Mm-hmm.
the old Victorian homes, like these historic sites, we would rob ourselves of the richness of the history of this
Mm-hmm.
land. Or to even take it deeper, in this area of the world, there were First Nations. I'm in Canada. There were First Nations that first,
Mm-hmm.
this was the land that they migrated through, and it was part of their culture to be, the different tribes have different areas, but like they were stewards of this land. And we are being asked to look to the original stewards of this land, and how do we respect this land, and how do we care for this water, and how do
Mm-hmm.
we um where I am, you can forage for so much medicine and so much food, and looking to some of these traditions in order to create renewal, like in
Mm-hmm.
order to innovate. Like we're learning so much now about the effects of glyphosate on the gut biome, and then
Mm-hmm.
we're learning how we can heal that by diversifying our own gut biome by so many different things. But it is a direct reflection to the health of the soil that you're eating out of, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so we're being asked to go back to these old traditions of like uh, not monocrops, but permaculture or biodynamic farming, or looking at the gems from the history and the tradition, and not forsaking that for the sake of innovation, because we've kind of done that, and Saturn's coming
Yeah.
around to call us out on it. Saturn's like, I saw you innovating. I saw you innovating with those chemicals, and I saw you innovating with those monocrops, but guess what? It's not actually working.
Right. No, I love that, because it's true
Right?
that when if you forget history, and we usually, like, the newest history wipes out the older history, or they say the winners write the history,
Yeah.
and then that becomes the standard of the history, but everything before that is lost. So similar, in the US, we have a lot of all the native peoples in the US and all of their traditions that have largely been really marginalized, and
It's
how much you
horrible.
can learn by looking at the whole history, and what worked and what didn't work, and how one affected the other. So yeah,
Yeah.
I like this coming up. I think it'll be an interesting juxtaposition between those two.
And see how easy that is for everybody listening. Like, we can have the conversation about both sides of the story, and neither of us are making each other wrong. We're just like,
Hmm.
oh, wow, yeah, that too. And
Yeah.
so instead of or, but, stop, it's, oh, and interesting.
Hmm.
Wow. Let's think about it from that perspective too. Thank you for going back and forth with me on that. I think
Oh,
it's good.
totally. Yeah.
And then the other thing that I kind of skipped in the chronological order, but on the same day that Pluto is opposite Mars, which is June 5th, we also have one of the two Mercury aspects, and this is Mercury square Neptune. Now, Mercury square Neptune, to me, I like circled this so big in my calendar, because this is asking you to pay attention to your dreams. We
Oh.
need to remember that communication isn't just our verbal and our written communication. Our
Hmm.
communication includes body language. It includes um, the psychic realm and our intuition. It includes our dreams. It includes everything left unsaid. We communicate in so many ways beyond language, and
Hmm.
beyond our speech and our emails and our texts and our, the more commonly thought of forms of communication. And that's what this is saying, is like, don't stop listening when the words stop being spoken or typed. Keep
Okay.
listening. Like, what is in the space between?
Hmm.
What can you hear when you quiet down the analytical mind and enter the space of the subconscious mind? Are you able to wake up inside of your dream? Is there an opportunity to go to bed with intention to remember your dream? I accidentally ended up with a friend's book that is all about dreaming. And at Attune to the Moon, the platform that I created, we have somebody who does dream work. And it's kind of funny, because I just asked her to look at her schedule of when she would be able to start a dream course. And
Hmm.
she was like, what about June 4th, 5th, and 6th? And then we put it on the calendar, and I didn't even look at the astrology, because I was just
Uh-huh.
thinking about her life and her schedule and
Uh-huh.
what's going on there. And then, of course, right before we put it all out into the world, we're like, hey, wait a minute. Mercury square Neptune is literally saying, pay attention to your dreams that weekend. And because Mercury only has 2 aspects, the entire retrograde, and this is one of them, I would actually spread this, hey, pay attention to your dreams or pay attention to your subconscious mind across the entire retrograde. And then Gemini season ends on the 20th of June, and that's the summer solstice. And we could talk about that more in the episode that we do on Cancer season.
Yeah.
But just as a little teaser, that's also on the same day Jupiter stations retrograde. So we've got, so now at the end of Gemini season, we have Pluto, we have Saturn, we have Mercury, we have Jupiter, all retrograde. And shortly afterwards into Cancer season, we also have Neptune stationing retrograde. So
wow,
we are moving towards a slow down.
Well, that's something to look forward to. So we will talk more about that in our Cancer episode. Is there any last things you want to say then about Gemini season before we wrap up?
Well, if people are looking for more support and understanding on this, we actually decided to do this Mercury retrograde a little bit different in the way that we have support. We have just a workbook. So if you don't want to show up on any live calls, but you want a workbook with an outline of the astrology, some information about Mercury, understanding Mercury in your own chart, and then we even throw some fun things in there like a word search and silly stuff, tarot card reading and or spread. We make it kind of fun. That will be something that you can find at Attuned to the Moon. But if you feel like you want to be more immersed in community, we actually do a proper Mercury retrograde course where there's an opening ceremony the day Mercury stations retrograde on the 28th. There's a closing ceremony when Mercury stations direct on the 22nd of June. And inside of those, the opening and closing ceremony, you have 3 distance Reiki sessions with he's actually my husband, but his Reiki is just amazing. And then 3 workshops to really help you work with these energies, like work with the Mercury retrograde. And then along with that package, you get 3 class credits for any of the other public classes that we host on Attuned to the Moon. And you can use those to attend either the full moon circle with Sasha, who's also the dream work teacher, or the new moon circle with me, or we have mythological hypnosis, and that's Nadia, and she'll be working with asteroids, or it's just a more comprehensive immersion into how to get the most out of this Mercury retrograde. So
this is the Attuned to the Moon website.
That's right. attunedtothemoon.com. That's really my playground where we get into more of the embodiment work.
All right. And you can find the Attuned to the Moon link on conversationsfromtheedge.net. I know the quality of the things on your website. So if it speaks to you to do some really deep Mercury work, highly recommend checking it out. So, and all your other links are on conversationsfromtheedge.net as well. So you're
including the discount code for your listeners.
Including the discount code. So for half off of Expander Pass. So check that out as well. And so also your Instagram and all your other links are on there. So I am looking forward to our Cancer conversation because it sounds like we're moving into a nice, quiet, hopefully retrospective time.
If we do it right.
All right, Jana, it's been lovely talking with you again, and I'm looking forward to talking again soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
This is your host, Kristine Madera. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation from the edge of consciousness. You can find all our conversations at conversationsfromtheedge.net. You'll also find links to schedule a private conversation with me or any of my friends, as well as tools to help you expand your own consciousness and explore what's possible for you outside the boundaries of your current perceptions. Feel free to use this podcast to start your own conversation by sharing it with friends, on social media, in your blog, or even in your own podcast. And as always, Live the adventure of pushing your own edge. It's the most amazing adventure there is.